Hi, I'm Conrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, a magazine for your ears featuring in-depth conversations with fascinating people from sport and politics, science and culture, business and beyond. Every week you can download new episodes in which top journalists from across our newsrooms talk to compelling people about the definitive stories of the day. In this episode, we talk to Rutger Bregman. You might remember the Dutch historian and author from a 2019 appearance at the World Economic Forum in Davos, which went viral after he called out the many millionaires and billionaires there for tax avoidance. He joins us today, however, to talk about everything from the loss of America's moral authority after the election of Donald Trump to why we need more ordinary people speaking up and defending principles of human decency. The magazine this week features an extract from Bregman's new book, Moral Ambition, examining our monstrous and long-running cruelty to animals. And hosting our conversation this week, which delves into the corrosiveness of misogynistic male influences to the role of realistic idealism in improving the moral trajectory of our society, is Good Weekend acting editor Greg Callaghan.
Thanks, Conrad, and welcome, Rutger.
Thanks for having me. Great to be with you.
Now, in your book, Moral Ambition, you basically say that most people waste their lives or they don't reach their full potential and they could be doing things to make life better for all of us. What do you actually mean by that?
Well, maybe not most people, Greg, but a lot of people. So there's one study that was done by a couple of economists a couple of years ago, and that study found, after interviewing 100,000 people in more than 40 countries, that around 25% of people in those countries think that their own job is socially useless. So it's not me saying it, it's people themselves saying it about their own jobs. And that seems like an enormous waste of talent.
When you use the word useless, when people say their work is useless, does that actually mean that they don't find the work satisfying, or that they think the job itself is pointless?
So I think it means that they could go on strike and it wouldn't matter all that much. So during the pandemic, we discovered this whole category of jobs called the essential jobs. The teachers, the nurses, the care workers, you name it. Well, if they go on strike, that's a pretty big problem. But if, say, all the marketeers go on strike, or a lot of corporate lawyers go on strike, or bankers go on strike. Well, I'm a historian, and I once asked myself this question: has there ever been a strike of bankers throughout history? Turns out there was only one in 1970 in Ireland, and that strike lasted for 6 months. And after 6 months, the bankers came back and said, all right, we'll get back to work, because nothing really happened. The economy just kept growing. Now, I'm not saying that like all finance is socially useless, obviously not, but it is like a risk category, right? If you start interviewing people, then quite often, if they're like what a friend of mine calls the Bermuda Triangle of talent. So you've got consultancy, you've got corporate law, and you've got finance, sucking up so many of our best and brightest. A lot of those people think that their job doesn't contribute much to society. Yeah,
so a lot of us do labour away at jobs that don't necessarily contribute much to society. But then some people are happy doing that because they're earning lots of money, for argument's sake. Not everyone has the kind of desire to improve the lot of humanity. They're just pretty much the sort of people that probably don't see much beyond the end of their own nose, really. They've got their own lives, and that's how they think.
Sure.
Aren't you up against that kind of basic human narcissism when you talk about, making the world a better place?
Well, look, it's a free country, so people always have the right to be boring, right? People have the right to live a predictable life. So if someone goes to a top university, to Oxford or to Harvard or whatever, and they really desperately want to go to Wall Street, make a lot of money, and not really make a positive impact whatsoever, they're free to do so. I wrote this book for people who are yearning for something more, who want to build a legacy that actually matters. I studied the great pioneers of the past, the abolitionists, the suffragettes, and I discovered that these people often had the idealism of an activist, but also the ambition of an entrepreneur. So this book is basically a call to arms for people who, do have that hole in their soul, who are like, I could do so much more, but here I am stuck in this cubicle. How do I get out? And yeah, that's what the book is about.
And you give some pretty stunning examples of people who have basically, for lack of a better expression, stuck their necks out. You mentioned Rosa Parks, the black woman sitting on the bus back in 1955 in Alabama, who refused to give up her seat for a white person. She became a symbol of the civil rights movement, of course. But as you point out in your book, she kind of had a history. She was an activist before that kind of huge turning point, wasn't she?
Absolutely. So everyone knows this story, or at least everyone thinks they know about this story. You know, a very brave woman refuses to stand up for a white woman who wants to take her place. And then in that way, a whole movement gets started, the famous Montgomery bus boycott. What a lot of people don't know is that actually there was the so-called Women's Political Council that was planning this bus boycott for many months, but they were just waiting for the right moment. And there were many, many women before Rosa Parks who were also arrested. So, for example, a couple of months earlier, a young woman named Claudette Colvin was thrown out of the bus because she didn't want to give her seat. In that sense, Rosa Parks wasn't that special. But this political action group was so strategic that they were just waiting for the right symbol, you know, the right mascot of their whole movement. And Rosa Parks turned out to be, a really brilliant activist as well. She had actually done quite a bit of training in a school in Tennessee for activists. So it's really interesting. People think that, these kind of things happen spontaneously. No, to the contrary. This was a movement that, in my view, was very morally ambitious. They saw winning as their moral duty. You know, there were not like the modern day activists, you know, shouting, kill the patriarchy or tax the rich or defund the police or whatever on Instagram. No, these people knew how to get shit done, you know, how to build an actual movement, how to get a law through parliament. And I admire that a lot. And I think we can learn a lot from them.
I think we can too. I think if the people who do take this kind of stand are by nature very, very brave people. You also mention the man in a large crowd of thousands of people giving a Nazi salute. He's the one person in a very famous photograph who has his arms folded resistantly to the Nazi salute. You found out some interesting details behind that photo.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a very famous photo. Like everyone listening will, if they look it up, they will immediately recognize it. Indeed, it's at a shipyard. Adolf Hitler was coming there, and there's a huge crowd, indeed, all giving the Nazi salute. And here's this one guy who's basically standing, you know, with his arms folded and saying like, or giving this impression like, I don't do this. And, when it was discovered in the 90s, it caused a big stir, and still every now and then it goes viral, usually with the message, be that guy. I really delved into the history of this man and realized that actually this was just it. Like, he didn't get much done apart from that. He still worked at that shipyard producing for the war machine. He in no way joined the resistance or anything like that. I mean, he didn't really have a substantial positive impact for others. So this is what I in the book describe as the noble loser, right? This is what you see a lot among progressives and, among some of my friends on the left. They lose the elections again, and then they say, well, but at least we stood on the right side of history, right? At least we had the right opinions. And it's that kind of purist attitude that is, I think, fundamentally morally unserious. So look, we can still deeply admire the courage of someone like that, but we got to keep in mind that in the end, it's about actually achieving results.
So where would you put that sole man in Tiananmen Square in 1989 facing the tanks? That was of the Chinese Communist Party. Where would you place him? Because that was an extraordinary act of bravery.
Oh, absolutely. Incredibly brave. And look, don't get me wrong. Like, protest movements have been utterly essential throughout history. And I think we desperately need one in the US right now. I mean, I moved to the US in September of last year, on an immigrant visa. And I'm like, okay, well, it's a situation where we could definitely use some people in the streets to protest against the decline of democracy. So I'm really only making the point that we got to look at these things like tools in a toolbox. And we should resist falling in love with our own methods. So yes, sometimes we need radical climate activists occupying squares, to put pressure on politicians. But then sometimes we need really smart lobbyists who deeply understand how a law gets through parliament, and how to push the right buttons, who really know where the money goes. Or sometimes we need entrepreneurs who build amazing companies, who actually know how to create all kinds of innovations in sustainable energy or sustainable proteins or whatever. It just depends. And that's what moral ambition is about, is thinking really hard about what is necessary right now and how you can make the biggest possible impact.
It's also about having very sound values and being generous of spirit too. I'm thinking of Jonas Salk, who refused to patent his polio vaccine back in 1955. In today's money, he gave up $7 billion, but saved thousands of lives, or thousands of children's lives, saving them from disability and premature death. That kind of generosity of spirit, you could argue we don't see that so much these days.
Well, look, I'm not the kind of historian who will tell you, oh, everything used to be better, because, once you really dive into the history, things were pretty bad in the past as well. Look, there's one reason why I wanted to devote a whole chapter in the book to the power of technology and positive innovations, because these days we often have a pretty dark vision of what tech can do, right? When I say the word technology, tech, we think of billionaires who shoot themselves up in space, and who don't pay their fair share in taxes, or we think of Elon Musk and his chainsaw. Well, that is certainly one side of the coin, but there's another side as well. I mean, the big progress we've made as a species in the last 200 years, the fact that we have so much wealth that we can also redistribute more fairly is very much so because we made incredible technological progress. And indeed, the triumph of vaccines here, I mean, it's just like we should have like a national celebration every year. Just, polio, if you look into that history, it is so shocking. People were super scared. I mean, I have young kids. Our youngest is 4 months old. Our oldest is 3 years old. And just imagine living with the constant terror of that your kid might get polio, and how horrible that will be. That was just daily reality for people in the 50s. They were scared of two things, of the atomic bomb and of polio. And then along comes Jonas Salk, and a brilliant technological innovation, works on it for years with a brilliant team. And I read the eyewitness reports of how people responded back then, in the 50s, when it was announced that Jonas Salk had invented the polio vaccine. You know what they did? They went out in the streets. They started singing. They started celebrating. It was very moving to read about that. Anyway, that sometimes makes that, if you don't think about today, like what did we do when the COVID vaccine was announced? We can learn from our from the people in the past.
And now we have RFK in America trying to wind back vaccine technology. Now you're in the US you just said living there at the moment. Mm-hmm. It appears that the country, since Trump's victory, appears to have taken a turn for the worse. So it's not even an issue of left or right politics anymore. It's basically boiling down to what's right or wrong. Empathy appears to have become unfashionable under the Trump administration. Morality appears to have become unfashionable. Would that be a fair statement?
Absolutely, 100%. So the Republican Party is in a state of complete moral collapse. It is now being ruled by, well, in the best case, by cranks and crazy people, but in the worst case, by just downright evil people or incredibly selfish people. It's really shocking to see. And honestly, it's also worse than I expected. If you just see the incredible amount of just the economic damage that's being done, or the betrayal of, decades-old allies. It's deeply depressing. I think that there's now a very real chance that there will be an authoritarian breakthrough in the US in the next couple of years. That's what sociologists call democratic backsliding, where you just gradually move towards a system that can't really be called a democracy anymore. There are already substantial steps being taken in that direction. So yeah, sorry, I don't have happy news there. It's a scary world we live in.
Indeed it is. It's particularly telling that the Republican congressmen and senators, who previously, many of whom were so critical of Donald Trump's behaviour and saying he was bad for America and potentially would be an authoritarian leader, are now backing him. Yes. And they're watching their own democracy erode, and the country's standing in the world erode as well. I mean, what does that say about these people? What does it say about human behaviour being so grossly self-interested, them putting themselves, their own self-interest above their country?
And I would say they're not even doing that, because they'll go down in the end as well. So they're just incredible cowards. That's true for Republicans in Congress. It's also true for many business leaders in the US. I mean, I was just reading about the richest law firms here in the US who just refuse to sign a letter to even support, their colleagues who are currently being targeted by the Trump administration because they, were involved in the lawsuits against Trump under the Biden administration. So yeah, it's just deeply depressing. I guess where I find some hope is again in history, because we know that it doesn't have to be this way. If you go back more than a century, you end up in the Gilded Age, in America, which was also an age of incredible immorality and incredible vice and inequality. The robber barons, the Vanderbilts, for example, building these huge mansions on Fifth Avenue here in New York, only thinking about themselves. But then at some point, there was a counter movement against that. And it was a revolt of elites. That's really important to keep in mind. So just take someone like Alva Vanderbilt. I don't write about her in the book. The book was already getting too long. But she was married to a Vanderbilt. She got divorced. And then a little bit like some of the first wives of the billionaires in our age, like Mackenzie Scott, for example, the former wife of Jeff Bezos, she became a huge philanthropist. So that was like her big FU to her former husband. And she became one of the most important suffragettes, spent the rest of her life fighting for women's right and fighting for the women's right to vote. And that is honestly what we need right now. That's also what this book is very much about. It's about looking for a moral maxima. We do not live in an era anymore where you can say, oh, I'm just doing good by doing well. I'm donating a tiny percentage of my profits to, charities that I really like and that are good for my PR. No, come on. This is really the time to step up and to really make a substantial difference, especially if you have capital, whether that's financial capital, social capital, cultural capital, like people who can take a hit, who have something, they need to use what they have. So that's my slogan right now. It's not check your privilege, but use your privilege to make a damn difference.
Yes, you really do shake up one's thinking quite a bit. I found this myself reading the book, and one of the things that struck me that as absolutely a very wise reflection was how some progressive groups become their own worst enemies by shutting out potential allies. And you give the example of America's pro-choice organisation, NARAL, acronym, saying that just before Roe versus Wade was overturned in 2022, they put out a post saying feminism that doesn't include trans women and girls is not feminism. So it is kind of a little bit of self-sabotage, isn't it, going on with if things are absolutely set in cement like that?
Yeah. Look, I spent most of my time in the book dunking on progressives, but that's also because I expect more of them and they should do better. And this is a good example. A couple of years ago, indeed, in the midst of the pandemic, there was a total breakdown among progressive organizations in the English-speaking world, and I think we saw it in other places as well in Europe, where there was just this mentality that people were obsessed with their own purity, right? And there was obviously this cancel culture that was obvious to everyone, but also just a refusal to work with others who, didn't agree with you on like all points. And that's just, again, it's deeply morally unserious. Sometimes you hear these activists saying, we got to fight. I'm like, well, fighting, that's winning elections, right? That is fighting. Then you are fighting for people. Then you have power. And with power, you can make a difference. So if you believe that just, shouting your radical stuff on Instagram, is helping you win elections, I just think that you live in some kind of fantasy world. Very often you need to build coalitions, right? You need to think really hard about what works. And yeah, that means that you can't always, just gaze at your navel and say whatever you think. That's, again, it's deeply unserious. And I think that was really clear a couple of years ago when you had this total breakdown. And indeed, as Roe v. Wade was being dismantled, that the main pro-choice organizations in the US, they were not fighting the enemy. They were fighting each other because, apparently their colleagues weren't radical enough.
And that is a real danger now with social media, of course, because of the algorithms basically give you information you want to read. So you can read all this nice the counterbalance critiques of what's happening, for argument's sake, in America at the moment, and think, well, there's a large section of the population here really find many of the changes being executed by the Trump administration deeply troubling. So you can look at this and read it and think, well, there's a real kind of counter, not so much a counter revolution, but a counter challenge to this way of thinking, but it's kind of illusory, isn't it? Or because it's just people venting on social media.
Yeah. Sometimes these people are being described as radical. So like woke people are then described as people who go too far. And I'm always like, no, they don't go nearly far enough. They're mainly policing our language. They're mainly discussing, what the right words are to describe all the injustice in the world. But, in the end, it's not about like which words we use. I mean, words are important. They shape our reality to some extent, but it's much more important what people actually do. So take something like the modern environmental movement. A huge part of that movement is obsessed with people's own environmental footprints. So you have all these commandments today, right? Commandments such as don't fly, don't eat meat, don't have kids, don't use plastic straws. And look, I get some of it. I'm pretty much vegan myself, but I don't consider that my great contribution to the world. Because if you think about it, if you do everything right in that regard, then you have reduced your footprint to almost zero, I guess. And then you might as well not have existed. So then death is the highest ideal. Which is not very ambitious, which is not how we're going to solve this climate crisis. We're going to solve it by building an insane amount of sustainable energy. And if you now look at why that's often not happening quickly enough, well, you can start ranting about, the billionaires and the corporations standing in the way. But honestly, it's very often just NIMBYs, not in my backyard people abusing environmental laws from the 70s and the 80s. So it's very often also like governments and local governments that are just not delivering. Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, two American journalists, have just written a great book about this called Abundance, where they say that we really need a liberalism that builds, not just an obsession with the right procedures and using the right words and the right vibes and feelings, etc. Just like no victim of gun violence was ever brought back from the dead, because of some thoughts and prayers. We've never had affordable housing, because we used more inclusive language. That's just not how it works. You get affordable housing if you build it. We need a big mentality shift there.
Now, human beings, they don't treat one another particularly well, but if there's one thing that we could say is that we humans treat animals far, far worse. You talk about industrial farming and food production in the book, and it's epically cruel. What do we do with a rapidly growing global population, notwithstanding fertility rates dropping in the developed world? The world population's still increasing. What do we do? You mentioned veganism and vegetarianism, and I completely agree with you that, you know, amongst the vegetarians and vegans I know, they don't really talk about it very much. And yet it's the non-vegan and non-vegetarians' perception of them that can become quite hostile. Yeah, they don't take a moral stance about it. They don't get on social media and say
some
that.
do.
Some do, but not amongst the ones I know.
I can introduce you to a couple of them. Look, I've always found this question of how will the historians of the future look back on us to be utterly fascinating. We can look back on, say, the Romans and be horrified by some of the things they did. Like, they had the Colosseum where they threw naked women in front of the lions just for entertainment during lunchtime. But then the Romans would say, well, look, we're actually really civilized because we don't sacrifice children to the gods anymore, you know, as some of those barbarians do over there. So you got to keep in mind that every civilization throughout history has seen itself as like the endpoint, the most civilized of all. And it would be quite coincidental if that would be actually true for us, right? That we have figured it all out. I think that's quite unlikely. We are probably doing some things today that can be considered moral catastrophes, similar to legal slavery, for example, which we now find horrifying, but that was pretty normal in the 17th century in most countries, and not just in European colonies, but across the globe. So, what could it be? And so in the book, I make the case that the way we treat animals is the most obvious example here. I mean, every week there's new scientific evidence coming in about how extraordinary animals are, how much smarter they are, how much more sensitive they are, how much more capable they are of suffering, which is in the end the most basic question, like, can they suffer? That's the question that matters most. And the answer is yes, a resounding yes. And then if you look how we treat fish, well, we build these huge underwater torture chambers for them, and we call it fish farming. We treat chickens in the most horrible ways. You know, we've bred them to basically live their whole lives in a body that it has become their prison. So they can't really grow old anymore, these Franken chickens, because, you know, their body just collapses because they grow so quickly. So that they produce as much meat as possible. It's really horrifying, but indeed, people don't really want you to talk about it because meat is so tasty, which is true. So then the question is, how do we get out of this? For me, it's now pretty clear that just shouting "go vegan" is not going to get us there. I mean, we've been doing that for 50 years. We've had great people like the Australian philosopher Peter Singer, you know, who made the case in the early 70s in his brilliant book, Animal Liberation. And back then he thought, you know, that just publishing that book, surely, you know, if people read it, then that should be enough. Well, sadly, no. So what we need is a technological revolution. Just like the birth control pill caused modern feminism, I think that new sustainable proteins, clean meat, precision fermentation, another very promising technology, I think that will just create alternatives that taste so good, that are much cheaper and also much healthier, that then at some point people are like, you know, why would you even eat meat from a real animal? And then things will start to shift, and someday our children will look back and be absolutely, absolutely horrified by the moral monsters that chose to eat their own weight in meat every single year.
Now, I wanted to ask you about Andrew Tate, the self-declared misogynist who has a huge following, something like 9 or 10 million followers on social media, 90% of them young men. Mm-hmm. And he basically appeals to their base instincts, make lots of money, control women. They've recently returned to Romania after being invited to the US by the Trump administration. When I say they, it's Andrew Tate and his brothers. Have influences like Tate made it more difficult for us to take a moral position in society? Is it just being eroded by these, for lack of a better word, immoral people?
Well, I think that they are just symptoms of this moral collapse. Let me give you an example. Since the 1960s, there has been this freshman survey among American students in which they were asked after their most important life goals. And in the late 60s, 90% of American students said that developing a meaningful philosophy of life was one of their most important life goals. Only 50% said that making a lot of money was one of their most important life goals. Now, today, those numbers have reversed. So only half cares deeply about developing a meaningful philosophy of life, while 90% of students care very deeply about making a lot of money. This is not human nature. This is culture. And that also means we can change it. I think Andrew Tate is also an example of how we've just utterly failed at providing young men with role models. I honestly experienced this myself not very long ago. When our daughter was born, she got this lovely plaquette from my sister saying, "Nice girls don't make history." And we were like, yes, indeed, that's how we're going to raise her. So we bought all these books about, modern feminism and about how girls are powerful and girls are strong and girls can do anything. And our son was born a couple of months ago, our second. And then I was like, okay, so I'm really curious, like, where all the books are about what it means to be a man? And so far, I haven't really found those books yet.
It is fascinating, isn't it? Because most of the books about men, and there are a few, have been written by women, not many by men. And I wonder what that says about men, though. Not being self-examining, perhaps, not sort of finding it embarrassing to talk about masculinity, perhaps.
Well, look, there is such a thing as toxic masculinity, and Andrew Tate is the very pure form of that. It's like the most shallow, violent, sad, psychopathic form of what a man can be. But then there must be an opposite of that, right? What is the opposite of toxic masculinity? And I don't think we talk nearly enough about that. For me, it is heroic masculinity. So for me, masculinity is about, making progress, becoming more powerful, becoming more skilled, and then using that privilege you have or that capital you have or whatever you want to call it to help others. That is what heroic masculinity is. I find that funny. If I look at the young boys, some of the sons from my friends, I find it always funny to see them always walking around in this superhero world, right? One is a firefighter, one is a police officer. They're always like saving the world. It's also what I remember about my own childhood. I very much had this hero complex. Whenever I played computer games, it was like, saving the world. My mom would ask me, like, Rutger, what are you going to do tonight? And I would reply, well, I'm going to save the world, Mom, in some virtual reality. But that is actually a good thing, I would argue. It's easy to dunk on it, but the opposite of heroic masculinity is toxic masculinity, and surely we don't want that. So I think we got to get better at providing different role models for these young men, because many of them are utterly lost. They live in this TikTok reality, quite isolated. And the statistics are just super, super depressing. I mean, just yesterday, I read some new stats that came out about young men and the amount of them who just feel useless. That has doubled in the US since 2010. It's now 20%. In a way, we let that happen by not providing the alternatives and by just giving this form of heroin that we call TikTok and smartphones to them. Luckily, Australia here is ahead of the curve, and I hope that other countries are going to follow by just banning this toxic crap.
I hope so too. So just wrapping up, we've got so many huge challenges facing humanity and the planet. Do you describe yourself as an optimist or a pessimist? There's the old expression, of course, the optimists are happy and the pessimists are right. But which category would you put yourself in?
I'm a realist, of course, but I'm also hopeful. For me, hope is about the possibility of change. Actually, one of the reasons I wrote this book is that I got really annoyed with myself. Here I was, I'd spent about a decade of my career writing articles and books and providing commentary, giving my opinions about what other people should do to make the world a better place. And I was like, I'm going to write a book that will force me to change my life. And that's what it did. I co-founded this organization called the School for Moral Ambition. Everything I earn with this book is going into the movement. And we are helping as many people as possible to pivot their careers, to focus on the really important challenges, whether that's global health, 15,000 kids dying every day from easily preventable diseases, or the fight against the tobacco industry, or preventing the next pandemic. I mean, there's so much important work to be done, and we really need our best and brightest. It's all hands on deck. So we like to see ourselves as the Robin Hoods of talent. Robin Hood took the money from the rich. Well, we take the talent from the rich. And if people are interested in joining us, the website is moralambition.org. We're really building a community of like-minded, ambitious idealists. So everyone is welcome to join us.
And all power to you for writing the book and for forming the organisation as well, because we certainly need it to counter what's happening so broadly in society at the moment. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much as well.
That was Dutch historian Rutger Bregman being interviewed by Good Weekend acting editor Greg Callaghan on the latest Good Weekend Talks. Coming soon, we chat with Adelaide novelist Hannah Kent, author of the 2013 smash hit Burial Rites, set in Iceland, who has a new work of memoir about her time living there. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate and comment wherever you get your podcasts, and keep tuning in for more compelling conversations. Good Weekend Talks is brought to you by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Proud newsrooms powered by subscriptions. To support independent journalism, search Subscribe Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. This episode of Good Weekend Talks is produced by Conrad Marshall and edited by Tim Mummery, with technical assistance from Josh Towers. Tammy Mills is our executive producer, Tom McKendrick is head of audio, and Greg Callaghan is the acting editor of Good Weekend.